Hi there everyone, and welcome to another episode of Tip of the Week. So this week I thought I'd take you guys through how to create tiled textures in Photoshop. For your reference, this can be useful when you are creating brushes in the new version of Storyboard Pro. So if you're using Storyboard Pro 4, also if you're using the brush tool on Storyboard Pro earlier versions, then you have the ability to load in a texture as well. You can use this also in Animate Pro and Harmony. In the brush tool, you have the ability to load in a texture there, and I'll show you how that works afterwards. But let's just start by actually creating a tiled texture. So I have Photoshop open here, and what I'll do first is I'll create a new texture, and I'll set the size to pixels here. And normally it doesn't have to be such a big texture. You could do like 400 by 400, or you could do 200 by 200, you know, whatever size you think makes sense for your brush. And I do normally do a square texture just because for the brush tool what it does is it actually is going to kind of take the texture that you do here and it will tile it when you draw. So you have to make sure that it is a tile texture in this case. So I'm just going to grab my brush tool in Photoshop, and then what I normally do when I'm creating a tiled texture here is that first I just find a Photoshop brush that has some interesting texture on it. So I just use one of the ones that they already have, and I'll make sure that my brush here is black. What we want to have in our tiled texture is we want to have some regions of black and some regions of white, because the black part of the brush is going to be where you lay down pixels, and then the white part of the brush is going to be transparent. Now if I get this kind of laid in here, then at some point what I want to do is I want to make sure that this guy will tile well. And to do this, there's a handy trick in Photoshop. If you go up to Filter, then you choose Other, then there's this one here called Offset. And so what I normally do is I'll set this to, like, I don't know, something like that. So you can set it to about plus 80, and then you can set the vertical as well to plus 80. Let's just do it the same just to make sense here, and then click OK. And now what this does is it kind of just is overlapping. So if you see, this is where the end used to be over here, and it took the edge that was on this side and it brought it back over here. And so what we can do now is we can kind of draw over where that edge was so that we don't see a line there, or we don't see a gap there anymore. Now the best thing to do here now is just go to Filter, and then since you just did Offset, it's right there at the top, so you can do Filter Offset again, and then you might just want to do it a couple of times just to make sure that you fill in all those holes and gaps, and then I'll get this texture looking kind of interesting. And that's looking pretty good. So now let's say that I'm accepting this texture. I like the way it is. I can now save this out. And if you save it and you want to import it into Toon Boom technology, you can either leave it just as a PNG, like as a Photoshop file, or you can bring in a Targa file. That's this one right here. So I'll just leave it as a Photoshop file because that seems to make the most sense to me. And I'll throw it on my desktop there, and I'll call this Lily's Great Texture. Alright, so now that I have my texture file saved out there, what I can do is I can import it in. So let's do this first in Storyboard Pro, and I'll just open up a project here that I have. It's an empty project, there's nothing in there. Remember that when you're working in Storyboard Pro, you have the ability to work on a bitmap layer or on a vector layer, and when you use the brush tool on these different types of layers, then your advanced tool properties are a little bit different. So let's say now that I'd like to bring in a texture here. So what I can do is I usually just click on these advanced tool properties here, and so I can make some adjustments on there, and then I can select a texture that I want to bring in. And let's just, I could actually just take one of these guys to start out with. So it looks like, yeah, I do have a little bit less options on the bitmap import. So what I can do here is I can grab my texture file just by selecting the open for my folder. And then I can go onto my desktop, I can grab Lily's Great Texture, and now it loads it in there. And you see a preview at the top there of what it's doing. So basically what it's doing is it's tiling my texture as I lay down the brush. Now for the bitmap layer, because I have a little bit of different options here. Remember on the vector layer it had the minimum and maximum opacity. On the bitmap layer you usually control this via the flow. So the flow controls how many pixels you're laying down as you're doing it. And this flow you can also change on the fly as you're working. So it's very easy to you know, get a variety of different looks there. So depending on how I set up the minimum maximum flow, the spacing, which spaces out the stamping on the head, and the hardness, which kind of you can see the hardness is making it sharper around the outside or softer around the outside. So depending on how you set up these options, you can get a variety of different effects. Once I decide that I like this, I'm going to save this as a new brush, and I'll call this Lily's Great just to match, you know, my great texture. And now I can go ahead here and I can play around with this brush and see how it works. So if I actually zoom in there and check out what it's doing, it's taking my texture and it's tiling it in there. Very, very similar when you're working on the vector layer. So let's just you know, decide to create a new brush here on the vector layer. So I'll bring in the same texture, Lily's Great Texture. And then here, instead of having the flow, because the flow parameter is not something you can change on the fly in your vector layer, so instead you have the minimum and maximum opacity down here. And then I can also set the select the texture there. So when I actually draw with it, I get a similar look. I just have less variation in the lightness and darkness. I have a little bit of variation with my pressure sensitivity, but you know, it also depends on how hard my brush is and so on. So you can get a very similar looking brush. Let's just take a quick look here at how I import it into Harmony, and it will be similar if you're working with Animate Pro. So I'll just open up Harmony here. So when you're working in Harmony, it's actually quite similar. If you go to your brush tool, down here what you want to do, and you may want to create a new brush and name it while you're doing this so that you make sure that you don't change one of your existing brush. So I could call this Lily's Texture. And so what we want to do if we are ready to load some texture in here is you just want to make sure that you click on Enable Texture. And this little square right here is where you can click on it and then select the texture. So I can select the same Lily's Great Texture in there. And then now if I just start to draw with this, and maybe I'll just make my brush bigger so you can see it, then it works very similar where it's tiling the texture inside that region. So it's really that simple to get your texture loaded in there. And then you have down here the ability to set the minimum and maximum opacity that it will take into consideration from your you know, your pressure sensitivity on your tablet, as well as the size of the texture and so on. So these are all the properties down here for how you can modify how your texture looks. So another type of texture that you may want to create is a texture that will work on a pencil line in Harmony. And when you want to create this kind of texture, it's just a little bit different in a couple of ways. The first way is that usually you want the width to be more than the height, because instead of tiling the texture in both directions, what you're just going to do is you're going to tile it horizontally only. So I'll show you what this looks like. I'll just create my canvas here, 200 pixels by 400 pixels. And then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to create a new layer, and I'll trash the background layer, because what I want to have is I want to have a file that does have an alpha channel that does have transparency, and if I leave that background layer in there, then it kind of flattens the whole thing down without transparency. So now that I'm working on a layer here that doesn't have the background in it, then all I can do is I can start to draw something. So I'm just going to do something really obvious like this, and then I'll do my filter, other, offset, and in this case I'll filter it, or I'll offset it in the horizontal direction only, and click OK. And now I can do something funky like connect the two sides of this line here. And for this particular kind of a line, it doesn't have to be totally perfect, but you'll get the sense of what I'm doing here. So let's save this. Let's go to Save As, and I'll save this as Wavy Lily. Okay, so let's just do a couple of these just to play around with the idea. So, I can also do another one. Let's do another new one. And now I'll do the same thing where I'm going to trash my background. Oh, I have to create a new layer first, and then I can trash my background just by dragging this guy into my trash. And now from here, I could do something more textury, like I could once again grab one of these texture brushes that they've got, and usually I just pop up the diameter a little bit, and then I can just kind of play with this. Sometimes it's easier when you're doing horizontally tiled textures just to stay away from the border when you're doing it, and then do your offset. And now you can go in and clean that up. So just to have a couple of different styles, and you could even kind of like do whatever you want. Like, you can get creative with this stuff, because once you start to see what kind of effects it does, then you can do some more sort of tailored examples for your pencil line. But I'll just do some crazy stuff here. Okay, and now let's just filter it again, offset it again, just to see, make that a little bit better. All right, so let's save this as Lily Cool Pencil. Okay, so now if I pop open Harmony again, I'm going to go to Stage. Then what I have in here is, if I go to my pencil tool, it's really similar to what you do with the brush tool, where you have this area down here at the bottom, where you have all of the different textures that you can load in, and there's a bunch of textures that are loaded in here by default. So what you want to do with the pencil texture instead is you just want to click on the plus sign here, which allows you to add a new texture, and then I can check out Lily's Cool Pencil. And after you add it in there, you'll find it at the end of the list, so I can just select it in there, and then I can just try to draw with it. And you see how, as I draw with that, what it's doing is it's tiling the texture along the line and in the direction of the line. If you turn on soft tip here, then what it does is it tries to kind of just soften the texture around the tip. And so the difference is that here you see all the texture is kind of condensing into this circle, whereas here it's like it's just cutting the texture off at where the end of the line is there. So you can kind of choose whichever one is going to look better for the type of line that you're working on. So there's Lily's Cool Pencil. Just for fun, let's also import the other one that I did, the wavy Lily one, and it's going to be at the end of the list, and then I can try to draw with this one and see what that looks like. So even if I draw this as a straight line, so you see here, like if I select this guy with my contour editor, it's a totally straight line, but if I look at that wavy texture there, how it's applied on that line, then it just gives it some interesting information on that. So you can kind of play around with some of these ones. Keep in mind that when you fill the line in, it's going to fill to the center contour there. And so with the wavy texture here, it might not work in the way that I want it to. You just have to kind of play around with that. So yeah, and then when we go back and look at our pencil tool again, there's just one last little thing to be aware of. That what this little section down here at the bottom means is when I add a texture into this list here by clicking on the plus sign, what it does is it adds it into the list for this scene only. If I click on the arrow over here, it says copy current texture into preferences. So what this means is that if I choose to click on this arrow and I copy it into the preferences, then what this means is that I'll be able to access this texture from any scene file. So just be aware of that, and you can now play around with the pencil textures as well. So I hope that little session on creating tileable textures in Photoshop and importing them into our technology was helpful, and I will see you guys next week.